Morning, everyone. How are you? Yeah, it is morning here. Beautiful, bright morning here in California and Santa Barbara, but a pretty cold one too. And hey, I'm sorry, Thanksgiving. It's Valentine's Day, so happy Valentine's Day. Something to be thankful for. So normally I sort of frame everything and introduce things before jumping into what is on the website, the deep dive comments and all. But I want to jump right into what I put on there because I put a few facts in first, and I think they kind of say it all and they're worth noting. So let's jump right into those. So here we are. Let's scroll down. So this is from Project Drawdown. So there is an overlap this week insofar as, at the very top of Project Drawdown, number 1 and number 3 are food system things. First, wasted food, and then, eating a plant-based diet. So this is what Project Drawdown has to say, and they really hit on some of the, absolute major things here. Shifting to a plant-based diet rich in plants is a demand-side solution to global warming that runs counter to the meat-centric diet on the rise globally. So demand side means that's us, right? That's consumers. We can not demand this meat, and by doing that, we can make a big shift. So if you think about it, it's not a supply side. So we're not asking the suppliers of our electricity to come up with new ways of supplying it, say solar or wind rather than coal or natural gas. But this is, it hits with demand, which is us. And, the Western diet, and again, we could put this under the rubric we've been calling it the American way of life. This is spreading to the world, and meat rise is dramatic around the world now. And that's a problem, just the same way American consumer culture is on the rise, or automobile ownership is on the rise. But the diet comes with a steep price tag, 1/5 of global emissions. Yeah. So I'll give, you'll hear me quoting a number of times, either 15 or 16%, and here it says it is 20%. Numbers vary a little, and it depends on how they're calculated. So let me pop back one here. In part is if you just consider methane, and then in part if you consider the other climate footprint of food that we eat, like beef. So years ago, Michael Pollan, who wrote a great book called Omnivore's Dilemma, had a kind of a famous lecture. And he got up on a podium and he put a bag from McDonald's, which had a McDonald's meal in it, and 2 glasses with the like sort of black liquid in them, looked like it was coffee or something. And then he said, "I'll talk about these later." And he gave his lecture. And then in the middle of it, he noted that the food in the bag from McDonald's, to produce that, you needed what was in those 2 glasses, and they were actually filled with oil, crude oil. So it's not just methane, but they're direct CO2 emissions that come from the producing of food, and especially beef, since it's so intensive. And what I mean by that is, well, farmers have to put, gasoline in their tractors. They use fossil fuel derived fertilizers. Food has to be transported. You may know this fact that the average vegetable, for example, in the United States has to travel 1,500 miles before it gets to us. And even more amazingly, Idaho, which is known for its potatoes, if you eat potatoes in Idaho, on average, that potato is not coming from Idaho. Our food system moves things around a great deal, and that requires a lot of energy too. That's why people like Michael Pollan, who advocate for local, food and eating locally, they push that because environmentally it has a much better climate footprint, and 2, because you get fresher, healthier, better food. Anyhow, so depending on how you calculate it, I mean, somewhere between 15 and 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food, principally beef. Here's another fact. This should, if you remember nothing else from this module of the course, if cattle were their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So, number one and two, China and the United States, and coming up, number three are cows. That's absolutely amazing to me. I mean, absolutely amazing. Sorry, I should have had that back on the screen. But that cows would have that big a climate footprint, and that's the thing that most people are just not aware of. So you can see the issue here. But Project Drawdown has some more to say. Um, Yeah. Bringing about dietary change is not simple because, it's profoundly personal and cultural. And that's something worth noting here. And it's what we've been noting all along, and I'll pop back on and get back to it, that, this is not a technological, we are not in need of a technological solution here. Um, we need a cultural solution. We need to get people to stop thinking that, beef is the only way to eat. And that's going to be difficult because, as Project Drawdown noted, it's personal and cultural. Cultural because, a lot of identity of people, I'm not sure, wherever people come from in different parts of the world, those cultural identities have food wrapped up in them. That's often what makes a people a people. And what I mean by that is, yes, it's a language. People share languages, people share clothing, all that kind of stuff too. But food is really kind of at the at the epicenter of that. So people often have wonderful cultural identities, and that's great. But unfortunately, sometimes they have food in them that is problematic from an environmental point of view. And one of the great ironies, and the honors section was just talking about this, is that those cultural identities that involve food often are not, I don't know how to put it, the true cultural identities. What I mean by that is, um, well, someone noted in the my office hours that this person came from this person's family. Cultural background is from Armenia, and that this person was raised to think that meat was a big part of the cuisine, and families celebrated the cuisine and they ate a lot of Armenian food with a lot of meat. And this person actually had the opportunity to go to Armenia and found out the people there don't eat very much meat at all, that the original culture doesn't have much meat in it. And pretty much any culture that you can go back to, whatever your culture is, if you look back to it, even though it may have a lot of meat today, like Armenian American culture, and someone else in the office hours noted that his cultural background is Italian American, and Italian American is very meat centric. But if you actually go back to the Mediterranean diet that's based on, very little meat. So it's interesting because we often connect up meat with a cultural identity, but that is something that has been sold to us in the last century or so, which is something to think about. So it is interesting to think about that, and too, it's very personal, right? Which is what also Project Drawdown notes, that it's a very deeply personal decision what we put into our body, and also you kind of really hitting people where they live here, and people we should not be surprised if there's like a knee-jerk response to this. So jumping back here, plant-based options must be available, visible, and enticing, including high-quality meat substitutes. Also critical, ending price-distorting government subsidies, such as those benefiting the U.S. livestock industry, so that the prices of animal protein more accurately reflect their true cost. So yeah, two great things here. And just as kind of an aside, the idea that plant-based options must be available, visible, and enticing. For years, a number of people, myself included, and maybe we'll still try to do it after the pandemic's over, we're trying to put together, and by that I mean fund, having a food truck at UCSB that would have free food available, but it would be largely plant-based, to make people available of the options, because a lot of people just aren't aware of what it was. And David Cleveland, who's a former ES professor, was sort of at the epicenter of that, and he's since retired. But other people have gotten on board for that idea. But generally, the notion here that a lot of people are just not aware of the kind of options that are available for plant-based or largely plant-based diet. And if they were, they might find them very appealing. So, if you can do that, if you can, just show people, not even show them, allow them to taste what it's actually like, it could make a big difference. The other thing that Project Drawdown notes here is very important. Price distorting government subsidies, such as those benefiting the U.S. livestock industry, and that's the beef industry principally, so that the prices of animal protein more accurately reflect their cost. So this is, again, a government issue. So we've seen how the fossil fuel industry has an enormous influence on the U.S. government and can, and this is by way of funding individual politicians and can get, laws passed in their favor. The beef industry should not be taken lightly either. And that was part of the message in Cowspiracy, that the beef industry is very influential and has made has had some remarkable influences insofar as, for example, ag gag laws, which are agricultural gag laws, so that I may have mentioned this before, but and it's in Cowspiracy, but you cannot go into a factory where they're factory farming and see the conditions under which cows or animals live. You cannot go into a meat packing plant and any of those and take photographs or videos. If you do that, you will go to prison. I mean, it's a major deal. Why in the world would that be the case, right? Why would those conditions not be available to the public? I mean, it's free speech. Well, why? Because, and it underscores the beef industry and meat industry in general are very influential and powerful. Another way is that, okay, let's say that you are vegan or vegetarian or whatever. Okay, great. But guess what? You support the beef industry in a big way. What I mean by that is, well, if a person goes to McDonald's and they buy a burger, that burger is cheaper at McDonald's because of beef subsidies. The government is literally subsidizing the beef industry to make beef less expensive and make it desirable. It does not do it with other food industries. So it's not like we look at good plant-based options. We're going to look at lentils in a minute, and we say, we should subsidize lentils so the lentils are less expensive so that everyone can get them, so that especially people who need affordable food. But no, it doesn't work that way. We finance the incredibly powerful beef industry, and it's yet another example of why, to address this issue, we can talk about it as a personal issue, but we need to make system change. We need government change. We need political change. And we need politicians who are not influenced by these industries. So, let's go down. Again, from Project Drawdown. Plant-rich diets reduce emissions and also tend to be healthier, leading to lower causes of chronic diseases. Let me just come back and pause on that. There have been a number of studies, and I think the biggest one would be coming out of Harvard University with Walter Willett, who was in charge of what's known as the nurses cohort study, which basically is this multi-decade study of how people eat. And according to Willett, if you eat beef, take a year or two off of your life. It will literally shorten your life that way. Okay, it's not as bad as cigarettes. Smoke cigarettes, you'll take 10 years off of your life, but still you will shorten your life and you will have health problems because of beef, statistically. It is not a good food for us to eat as a species. It just is not healthy for us to eat. In fact, if you want to follow up on that, Kip Anderson has a follow-up film. After Cowspiracy, he made a film called What the Health? Not What the Hell, What the Health. And as far as I know, at least it was still streaming on Netflix, or I'm sure you can find it somewhere. And in that case, he doesn't focus on the environmental problems with eating meat, but rather the health-related problems. And they are really significant. And I want to talk in a minute about in detail about that. But The problem is, and you could draw a parallel here with the beef industry and the tobacco industry, is that here is an industry that has a product that is not good for human beings, that is literally shortening the life of human beings to eat. And yet this industry is, going all out to promote it and doing what they can, even though they know that it is not healthy for human beings and will shorten our lives. That's a problem. Again, it's not as dramatic as this tobacco, but now that we've seen tobacco and what tobacco has done, and now that we're seeing the same thing happening with fossil fuels, here we have it yet again with the beef industry. So let me jump back to Project Drawdown here. So business as usual emissions. Business as usual, you hear this phrase, BAU, by the way, a lot. Sometimes I'll be using it in upcoming lectures. That's as if we don't change anything, if we don't make any changes at all, business as usual. And we need to reduce emissions, but business as usual compared to adopting a vegan diet would reduce those emissions by 70%, vegetarian by 63%. Those two numbers are useful to look at together because, yes, a totally vegan, totally plant-based diet is generally better. But on the other hand, a vegetarian diet, and we're going to see in a minute how it's better, how it's good, is not that much worse, So it's something, if you're considering all this, to think about. If you're doing this and eating for the health of the planet and all, it's not the end of the world to be vegetarian too. In fact, it's not the end of the world just to stop eating beef. But it's interesting to look at those two numbers together. And two, Project Drawdown notes here, we'd save $1 trillion in health costs and lost productivity. It's just amazing. And again, if you look at, how the beef industry in particular impacts health and all the disease problems which has been done, then you realize that, healthcare, we need a lot more healthcare because of the beef industry. I thought it was great that Project Drawdown quoted Thich Nhat Hanh. For those of you who are in English 22, and we had the week on Buddhism, and I quoted quite a bit from Hanh because he's really one of the most, I think, one of the most useful, best thinkers about Buddhism, in particular mindfulness, alive today, although unfortunately he's very ill right now. But according to Hanh, making the transition to a plant-based diet may be the most effective way an individual can stop climate change. Well, yeah, there you go. It's not, in the sense that the most effective way you can help stop climate change is to vote. And for all the reasons we've just said, including in this particular instance, because by voting, you would make sure that, politicians are not influenced by the beef industry and all would help this. But Hanh is right. I mean, in a personal way, if there's one thing that you can do, well, your diet is something to really think about and to focus on, because it's just such a big deal. There are other things, though, and that's why we've talked about things like, having a car and flying and all the consumer stuff like clothing we have and all. But it is clearly a low-hanging fruit here, and it's something that is worth thinking about. So let me jump out of Project Drawdown and get into our comments. I watched Cowspiracy for the first time last year in the ES class. I haven't eaten red meat since. I want to comment on that in detail because that's a very good comment. And what I mean by this is, and in a minute I'm going to actually look at the numbers on it. If this all is overwhelming, I don't think, people have to worry about shifting entirely to a vegan diet or even a vegetarian one. Beef is the big problem. If you do what this person did and stop eating red meat, I'm going to show you in a moment, you will dramatically reduce your carbon footprint, like to a third or half what it is. So forget about everything else if you don't care about everything else. If you want to do this for the good of want to do something for the good of the planet and, hey, for the good of your health, this is the thing to do. Just stop eating beef. it's not that big a deal, but we'll talk about it in a moment. But I just wanted to underscore that if you watched, either Cowspiracy or Wasted, Cowspiracy especially, and you thought, well, yeah, okay, that's all great, but I just, and actually, someone was very kind enough to share their thoughts about them why they probably won't stop eating meat. If you're in that boat, okay, that's okay. If you want to do something, you can still do a huge thing. And arguably, and I actually have a lecture coming up arguing it may be even bigger in a way. And why I say that is because it may be more influential to other people. In other words, if you decide to not eat beef and you explain to your family the problems, both environmentally, health-wise, and everything, maybe members of your family may go along with it too, or friends go along with it. Why? Because, well, it's a lot easier than becoming fully vegan, and it's something that people may just do. Okay, but let me go to another comment first. Remember when Cowspiracy was released, people talking about it, I was 18 or 19 at the time. Remember not wanting to watch it and continue in a state of ignorance because I was afraid of what the documentary review and what I would be told. And I didn't want to live in a state of guilt. Terrible, I know. Yeah, it's not terrible. I think it's pretty common. And unfortunately, with a range of issues like this, I think people are in exactly that boat. They know, or they know that the knowledge is out there and they have a pretty good idea about it, but they just don't want to confront it. I think this is a huge problem. By the way, I don't mean to pick on this person in particular, but I'm saying the issue, this phenomenon that exists, that people are vaguely aware of it, but, ignorance is bliss. They just don't want to know more about it. And that presents a real challenge because people like this person are, as an audience, I think probably very open to the message of something like Cowspiracy. And what I mean by that, this person's not a climate change denier. They're not, denying it all. It's just that it's just something that they know, and they you just can't bring themselves to focus on it. I'm going to throw it out there because we're going to have a week coming up on communication, how to communicate this. And I think that's a very real issue that needs to be addressed, and we need to talk about the fact that there are a range of different people that aren't acting, and some people not because they wouldn't act at all, but because, these issues are so sort of overwhelming. So how do you communicate to those people and incorporate, a message within something more palatable? And I say that both if you're a filmmaker like Kip Anderson, or if you're like us, regular people. How do you talk to friends and all about something like this? Because there is that, in many cases, this sort of issue. Okay, here's something I want to show you, and we're going to spend a little time on this. Hopefully you can see this. This is, I'm going to try to get it all on the screen here. Okay, so what this is, and hopefully you can see it. There are a number of these out there online. This is a chart showing the relative emissions of food that we eat. So how does it work? So down here is the food. And we start with lentils and we go lamb from best to worst. And this is how much it's for a kilogram, but you could, we're used to pounds and all. So let's just call it a pound. So almost a pound of beef, just under a pound, 1 unit here. This produces over here 1 kilogram. Oh, and all these are for pounds. So a pound of lentils, pound of tomatoes, pound of beef, all the same. So, if you had, plates lined up with each of these food, it would have the same size portion with respect to weight anyhow. So lentils is the best one on the list because to produce 1 pound of lentils, there is just about 1 pound of greenhouse gas emissions, a little less than a pound. By the way, this number here, or this notation here, CO2e, you'll see that. What that means is CO2 equivalent. So there are other greenhouse gases. Methane is one. And, if they just told us what the methane emissions were, it would be kind of confusing because, how would that relate to CO2 and all? Well, people who do this have nicely come up with CO2e, which is CO2 equivalent. So even though beef is principally causing a problem here because of the release of methane, it's being converted into the equivalent amount of CO2, which is, nice because CO2e allows us to compare one-to-one, say, the footprint of eating beef with driving a car, even though they produce two different types of greenhouse gas emissions. Anyhow, you can see that lentils is terrific here because you don't even release a full pound of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 or equivalent, to produce the lentils. Let's jump over to our friend beef here. Again, same amount, 1 pound on each plate, but to produce that pound of beef emits 27 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at, 9 times 3 is 27, and 30 times 0.9 is 27. So the number I've thrown out before, that lentils, to produce a pound of lentils, 1/30th of the amount of CO2 emissions or equivalent are emitted than beef. That's where it comes from. So in other words, put it bluntly, beef is 30 times worse for the climate than lentils. So and by the way, lamb, which I'll go down here a little so you can see the full chart. Lamb is off the chart pretty much here, because if we go down here and we focus on it like this, notice that lamb is literally off the chart. Why are beef and lamb such a problem? Well, both cows and sheep are grazing animals, and cows and sheep have stomachs that are able to process grass. A lot of mammals can't do that. We cannot do it. Your dog can't do that either. So if you have a dog, if you ever notice your dog sometimes will eat grass when they're not feeling well, it's because they know that eating grass will make them throw up, because their body cannot eat grass, and it will respond by throwing it up. Some animals can eat grass, and cows and sheep are an example. And cows have a huge stomach, which is like huge, like 3 feet in diameter. That's basically like a chemical processing plant that is able to break down glucose, and out of that it's able to get energy, but it also releases carbon, and that carbon mixes with, because there's water in the system when the chemical plant, the stomach, is working, that water releases hydrogen. The carbon and hydrogen link up, and they form something called CH4, which is C, 1 atom of carbon, and H4, 4 atoms of hydrogen. That creates a molecule called CH4. We know it as methane. And where does all this methane come from? Principally because sheep and cows burp. Their chemical factory in their stomach is producing methane, and they're burping it out. People sometimes say it's all about cow farts, but it's principally burping. And it sounds funny. It sounds like that wouldn't be a big deal. You get enough cows and you get enough burping going on, and it's changing the global climate in a significant way. Seriously. Okay, so that's why these are so high here. But let's draw a line here, an imaginary line right here, because if you notice, everything over here is plant-based, everything over here is animal-based. And everything, even cheese, is just half of the climate footprint of beef. Just as a little aside here, not everything over here is actually plant-based. Notice that milk is way down here. Milk is better than tofu, and yogurt is only a little worse than tofu. But cheese is so much worse. So this is why it's good to learn about all this, right? And know about what's going on. So why is cheese so much worse than milk? Well, if you've ever made cheese, and you can make it at home or know anything about it, on average, it takes 10 pounds of milk to make 1 pound of cheese. That's the problem. Yogurt doesn't work that way. Yogurt is just sort of like, it curds and it produces yogurt right from milk directly. But cheese requires an enormous amount of milk. That's why cheese has such a high climate footprint compared to milk. And compared to all these animal products, it's very high. But still, high as it is compared to this other group of ones here, it is still half what beef is. Pork is less than half of what beef is. Farmed salmon is high because of the way the farming works and actually can produce methane and all too. Turkey, if you look at it here, to have 1 pound of turkey is the equivalent of more than 2.5. I'm sorry, 1 pound of beef is equivalent to more than 2.5 pounds of turkey. And look at chicken here, right? 3 times 7 is 28. So basically, you could have either 1 pound of beef or 4 pounds of chicken. 1 pound of beef, 2.5 pounds of turkey. 1 pound of beef, a pound of pork. And some things, of course, eggs even less, and canned tuna. So let's just say, right, you're not willing to jump in and make any big changes here with respect to your diet. But if you look at all these plant ones here, and just say you got an average of all these, right, because this is like 4, this is 13. Say it would cut that average, right, cut across like here at, say, 9. But remember, this is 27. So if you eat a medley of, other meats other than beef, say if you instead of having a steak, beef steak, you have a pork steak. Instead of having a beef burger, you have a turkey burger. And maybe instead you have a, chicken cutlet sandwich, or you have a chicken mixed in with your fried rice or whatever. If you did that and switched to this medley of animal-based, of other types of meat, and as on average 9, pounds of CO2 being emitted, that would be 1/3 of beef. So this is the message here, that just getting rid of beef, forget about, plant-based diet entirely, staying with eating meat, eating pork, eating turkey, eating chicken, you're going to reduce your climate footprint just by doing that to 1/3 or 1/2 of what it is, just by cutting out beef. So the comment that we had, a person said, after watching this film in this person's ES class, they stopped eating beef. And you can say, well, yeah, but they should have, stopped eating, all animal products. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I'm just saying right now, just cutting beef is huge. It is absolutely the thing to do. And why? And you can say, well, is pork really that different of a meat than beef? In terms of meat, maybe not, but in terms of how a cow's stomach works and the methane that's produced and how a pig works. So pigs, turkeys, chickens, they don't have a stomach like this. And a pig, for example, is totally omnivorous, like human beings. They eat anything. Having grown up on a farm, I can tell you, they eat anything. Chickens eat pretty much anything. And they don't graze. That's not the way they work. And that difference, the fact that we have domesticated these two particular animals, sheep and cows that graze, we did that for a reason, because, in my English 22 class, we go into detail, but the history of Western civilization has been the history of deforestation, and we cut down, forests across the planet as we've spread Western civilization. But to keep those forests from growing back again, we've allowed animals to graze there. Sheep have been especially good because when they graze, they actually rip up the plant that they're eating and they eat the root and all. So if a little tree sprouts up and is going to, potentially grow into a big oak tree or whatever, don't worry. If you have sheep on the case, they will rip it up and eat it. And that's how we've kept our the planet deforested, and we've gotten meat in the process. So you can see where, from a certain perspective, it was a win-win, but environmentally it's a lose-lose, because we've used these animals to keep the planet deforested when we needed the forest as a CO2 sink. And then, the meat that they were producing also released methane in the process. So a problem. So let's go over, so we talked about the plant-based options here. These are really extraordinary. I mean, look how low we are here. So the highest one is 3 compared to beef here, that's like 1/9 of it. And if you look at the average here, it's probably closer to like a little over 2 or 2.7. What that means is when you choose a plant-based option, so if you choose one of these meat options, like I said, maybe your average, greenhouse gas emissions will be a third of what beef is. If you pick one of these plant-based options, it'll be a tenth of what beef is on average. And if you do something like lentils, it'll be 1/30th. So lentils, and you see beans here as well. These two are particularly important. So I'll pop back on. Back in 2015, the United Nations had what the United Nations does, every year it has the year of something. And 2015, it was the year of soil. And why did they do that? Well, the UN wanted to tell the world that we really needed to focus on soil. It's incredibly important, obviously, right? Because everything that we grow, whether it's plants directly or indirectly, livestock animals, we need soil. And our soil is being depleted rapidly because of modern agricultural practices. The sad irony is traditional agricultural practices grew soil, and it was the home, having grown up on a farm, I can tell you that farmers used to take pride in the fact that you would dig down into their soil a foot or more, 18 inches, and get nothing but topsoil. Why was that topsoil so thick? Was because the farmers had composted every year and been taking care of the soil. So you think of farmers focusing on plants is what they do. But no, a smart farmer focuses on soil because the soil is the future of growing plants. Modern agricultural practices, monoculture, the way we do, it reduces the topsoil every year, and we are reducing it. And the UN wanted to draw attention to the fact this is a problem. I mention this because the very next year, the UN had, of course, a new year of, and it was the year of pulses. The year of legumes, they called them. Or was it pulses? I forget what they called it, what the exact name was. But okay, so what legumes are beans, basically, and bean-like things. So what would that include? Well, all beans, and includes peas as well. It includes lentils, and it includes things like peanuts, because peanuts are a legume. They're actually a bean. They're not a nut. So we call them nuts, and we, think them in terms of like tree nuts and all, like almonds or walnuts, but they're different. They're a plant that grows. Legume is everything that's a bean. A pulse is a specific kind of bean insofar as these are things that you let dry before you harvest them. And so having grown up on a farm, I can tell you what you do is you let a bean plant completely dry. So it goes from green to turning, like tan, and it's completely has all the moisture out of it because the moisture has gone out of the beans that are in those pods. And if you were to open them up, then you get a nice hard bean. It's great because solar energy and this process dries the food out for you. Pulses are dried beans, and there are quite a few of them. They're like first dried peas, but mainly we know dried beans and lentils. And these are also great because they can be harvested very easily now in the 21st. You could even do it back in the 20th century pretty successfully. So they use big machines, combines, to come in, and literally it cuts the plant down, brings them into the machine, it shakes out the beans and is able to separate them, and has willowing to get rid of all the other things. And it has a big hopper full of beans at the end. And these machines actually put the grind up everything else of the plant, put it back on the soil, where it is literally plowed into the soil and becomes compost. Voop, one big operation like that. That's why farmers in the United States, and like the Midwest in the United States, those really big farms, it's not very labor intensive. One farmer can produce enough food for 140 or 150 people. Pretty extraordinary. It can be done, carefully and organically too. But even though you're using a machine like that and all, you saw with the number of, with lentils and pulses, still it has a very small environmental footprint. And a very big part of the equation here, because human beings can eat those things. The problem is with beef, one of the principal foods. So cows traditionally graze, and here's one of the great ironies here. Um, Cows, their stomachs have evolved to graze, to do what I told you about, be able to process grass that we can't. And if you have, pasture raised beef, that's exactly what it does. But most beef in the U.S. and the world is not grown that way. It's grown in factories. Cows never leave a factory once they're in there. And they are not fed grass. They are fed principally corn and soybeans because we can grow those so efficiently. Those farmers I told you about that can grow that. The problem is we grow those things, soybeans and corn, and we feed it to cows. And, it takes many times more, and not dissimilar to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but less, like maybe 15 times more pounds of soybeans to make 1 pound of beef. So the thing is, going back to our chart here, you could just eat the beans yourself rather than giving them to a cow to eat, and that is the problem here. Just to be clear, and I noted here, and you have to be careful when you eat, insofar as you can actually have meat, have plant-based things that would be over here in this category. And why? Well, as I noted a couple times, if, for example, you have asparagus that this time of year, the winter in California, most likely, it's coming from South America, because asparagus doesn't have long shelf life. It has to be flown up here, and that flying adds a lot to its climate footprint, so much so that, it's almost equivalent to chicken here. And other crops will do that. Not all will. So things like bananas, for example. Bananas are also being brought from all over the world, but they have a longer shelf life. They last longer. You can put them in a boat and get them here, and they will ripen along the way, and they have ways of making them ripen after they've been harvested. But you just have to be careful, which is why I'm not sure if you've gotten the lecture I've given yet, but I note that Denmark, for example, is sort of leading the world with a brilliant idea, which is to have this information on the label that you would look at when you buy food. So in other words, instead of just looking at the nutritional, composition of what the food is, you would see what the climate footprint is. And I think a lot of people, if they saw that, lentils were 30th of beef, might think twice about it. One thing to keep in mind here, well, by the way, if you look at rice, why is rice a little high? You think it might be the same as lentils. There's a problem, and the way this chart is set up, the green here is known as production emissions, and post-production is the darker color here. What that is would be like transporting the beans and things of that. So why do beans have such a high production emissions? Well, if you know about beans, you know that the way they work is you flood a bean field, in the process of growing beans. Well, that's all great. But in the process of that flooding, it actually causes decomposition to take place in the plant material, which produces methane. So traditional, or the agribusiness approach to growing rice means that it produces methane too. Now, is it a big deal? No, not compared to beef, because if you compare beef to rice, even though it has this problem, and people will tell you this, by the way, and that's something worth noting, that there's a lot of disinformation out there. And in the same way, the climate change deniers are out there, and they're being, what's behind, as we've seen, the climate change deniers, well, it's the fossil fuel industry. What's behind the attack on plant-based diet and veganism and all this? It's the beef industry. And you will find all sorts of disinformation out there, all sorts of information out there. And you'll find, blog entries saying, well, but methane is this huge problem, and scientists have done these studies, and let's look at these studies. And, they complain about beef, but methane from rice is a big deal. Yeah, it is, but it's 1/10 of what beef is. It's still no way near the problem, and it is a solvable problem. So you may know that UC Davis is one of the premier agricultural research institutes, well, in the U.S. or the world. I mean, there are others like Cornell, But Davis is absolutely terrific, and Davis works with sort of production that goes on in California, and we do grow rice in California. And now that we know the problem, the scientists across the world, including at Davis, are working at ways of producing rice without the anywhere near the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. We can solve that problem in particular. These are the kind of things that need to be done, which again underscores why, yes, this is personal action. Yes, it's political action, but it is something that scientists can help with. But let's jump on, look at this one last time, because I do want to get to some comments anyhow. But just notice the things here that you can do with, say, peanut butter, tofu, beans, lentils. There's a lot you can do, and let's not forget. I mean, milk can be part of that. Again, if you're a vegan, you might cringe at that, and it is worth noting that there are different reasons why you would want to go to a largely plant-based diet. You may want to do it environmentally. You may want to do it because of, animal rights, in which case you're not going to be keen on eating beef. You may want to do it just for keen on eating milk. You may want to do it, entirely for health reasons, to not have your life shortened by it. And you may want to do it just to be a better athlete, which is something I want to talk about in a minute. But it is something that, it's interesting because it's another one of those win-win, because eliminating something like beef is a benefit to all that. And there's another huge issue, which is a social justice issue. And that is, people on this planet by the hundreds of millions are starving, like 800 million right now. In terms of food insecurity, over 2.5 billion or somewhere around there are food insecure on the planet. And yet we grow more than enough food to feed all those people just for cows. In other words, we've built this industry to feed cows, and we figured out a way of distributing food to them, making sure that every cow gets enough food to eat. But we don't make sure that every human being gets enough food to eat. And if we shift it over and we grew those really good sources of protein, like, beans and lentils, we could grow them for human beings, and everyone on the planet would have enough to eat. So it is a win-win-win-win-win if you start adding up all the reasons why we should get rid of beef in particular. Okay, comments. 660 gallons of water for a single burger. Found that shocking. I just eaten a cheeseburger prior to dinner. As this is my comment in response to watching this film, I still love eating meat and will probably love meat for the rest of my life. So I was very grateful to receive this comment, by the way, and don't in any way think that if people, want to share things like this, that I find that a problem. I mean, I absolutely don't. I thought that this person was really helpful and we're going to see the comment here, helpful, and also that I just want people to to share what they think. We can all say, well, we're going to become vegan tomorrow, but I think a lot of people don't think that. So I think we need to address it and the reasons why. And this is why this is I put it right here at the top. It's such a good comment. Solution of no meat Mondays or eating the vegan burgers just doesn't seem like a good alternative to eating the classic burgers and ice cream. I probably sound like a bad person for admitting that I hate vegetables and love consuming animal-based products, but I don't envision an American future in which I can't go to Wendy's and order a 4 for $4, which is, I think, four articles of 4 types of food for $4. I do understand, though, that I must think about who I am buying from, and some of these meat corporations only care about monetary gain. Yeah, well, but again, the only reason Wendy's can sell you 4 different types of food for $4 is because they're being subsidized by the beef industry. And I'll just say, as an aside, there's a really fascinating film. There's so many films, I can't have you watch them all, but I did put it up on Gaucho Space, called Carnage. If you are interested in this and you liked Cowspiracy, it's actually about shifting to a largely plant-based diet in the future. So this person noticed that this person can't imagine a future where we wouldn't eat plant-based diets. Well, this documentary is set 50 years in the future and looking back at how that happened. But it's a comedy, and it's really funny because you have people. I may have mentioned it before, people looking back and horrified that they once ate meat and ashamed of it and all. So you can kind of imagine a future that way, and it's interesting to imagine one. But let me get to the rest of this comment here. Coming into this class with such a consumer-based, animal product-heavy, and non-minimalist background makes me feel like a bad guy for the climate crisis. So, one of the things that I want to stop again here is such a good point because industries that are the epicenter of this, like the fossil fuel industry, the beef industry, if people are going to be getting upset about it and, pointing fingers, they like nothing more than when we point fingers at each other. That consumers, for example, say, you're a bad person for eating beef and you're a bad person for being a vegetarian and not fully vegan like me. And you have to think that the beef industry just sits back and smiles because we're not pointing the fingers at them. They are the problem. And we're fighting back and forth. And I just don't think that's very useful. And I also think that we need to get to the epicenter of it. We're going to talk about that at the very moment because of the way that like beef is promoted to people and how we're convinced to use it and all. Let's go to the rest of this comment. But getting rid of meat is tough for someone who is 6'3", 200 pounds and plays sports. It's just hard to ask. I do agree that big corporations need to stop thinking for profit alone and should consider the well-being of the planet. And I won't be cutting meat out of my daily meals. I can agree to be more mindful of what I'm consuming. Great. But this notion here that to be strong, to be an athlete involves meat. There's a documentary. I do not have it up on Gaucho Space, but it currently streams from Netflix. And if you go to the website, the course website, and access this deep dive information, you can just link right to the trailer and watch it. This is a quote from, I want to give you a quote from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's one of the executive producers of it. I ate a lot of meat. They show those commercials selling the idea that real men eat meat, serious man food. But you got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality. So for this person and for anyone who thinks that, to be an athlete, to be healthy, to be at the top of your game requires eating meat, yeah, watch this documentary. I guarantee, I won't guarantee, but it may well change your life. And I say that not because I look at it and say, well, that's really important. I've had people come to me. So last fall, when the pandemic hadn't hit and English 22 was in person, I had a guy come to me after the course was over, and I remembered this guy because it sounded just like the person here because he was also an athlete and big, like 6'3" or so. I'm like 6'1", and I remember I had to look up to him, so he was big athlete. And he had watched this documentary because I suggested it for that class too. And he said it changed his life and it changed how competitive he was and how good he was. So watch this documentary because the argument that they make there, and they show a range of different professional athletes. And the guy actually who's narrating it is one of these ultimate fighting champions. So this is kind of, I don't know how else to put it, a badass guy. And in fact, you see him at the beginning. He's down here in California at Camp Pendleton teaching Marines, martial art techniques. But you see a range of people from, people who don't have big physiques like bicycle racers, there tend to be, not big bulked up bodybuilders, but you see big bulked up bodybuilders too. You see a range of body types, a range of sports, a range of athletes. And the message is always the same, that they went to a plant-based diet and it made them better athletes. And that film goes through the science of it and how, protein impacts your bloodstream and all. And you can see there's real science behind it. But then this goes to Arnold's comment, and why Arnold, I think, felt the need to be an executive producer here, is that, I want to quote Arnold here again, but you got to understand, that's marketing. That's not based on reality. So the whole notion we have that beef is good for you, that it makes you strong, that is what athletes need to have, for example, is all marketing. Sounds like something I would say, right? But that's Arnold. And I think, it's absolutely correct that marketing is convinced us of this, but if you look at the actual science, it's not there. The science does not suggest that that athletes, for example, should have beef. It doesn't suggest anyone should have them. But if you're one of the last holdouts, the idea that it's particularly important for a certain group of people, the science does not back that up. But, and why did it happen? Well, the documentary talks about it, and why it's a good documentary to watch. The beef industry for over 100 years, in fact, they go back to over 200 years ago when the idea first came out, has argued that and have pushed that idea and have told us that we need to have beef and the beef is important to us, when it's really not. That you can not only live perfectly fine on a plant-based diet, something that people, honestly, people didn't know that 150 years ago, but now we know, the science of nutrition has in many ways emerged in the last 150 years, and now we know that it's true, that it's just better. Okay, I'm not going to get too many comments if I keep doing this, so back to comments. Yeah. On this person, honestly, I didn't know about the emissions agriculture produces, So how are people who don't have an education on the environment supposed to know to stop eating meat? It goes back to the narrator questioning why no environmental groups have shined a light on this issue. We need to get the word out and help people ease into an environmental way of living. We just can't expect them to do this themselves without the right type of guidance. Such a great point, and really at the center of Cowspiracy. Cowspiracy, it's controversial, the film, for different reasons. First, that Kip Anderson lies about the total emissions, which I told you it's not 51%. With Project Drawdown, and I've been saying it's somewhere between 15 and 16 and 20%. But okay, but the other thing he does, which many people liked, and I think it kind of made the film famous, was he, called out environmental groups like the Sierra Club, went right in to talk to, the leaders of these groups and say, why aren't you doing what this person said in the comment? Why are you not communicating this to everyone? You call yourself an environmental group. He didn't say this, but Project Drawdown says, this food is 20% of the problem here. Why aren't you telling people this? Why are you not? And the best answer to that, I think, came from Michael Pollan, who was interviewed by Kip Anderson in Cowspiracy. And he said, but, you have to understand how these groups work. These are not, government groups. The Sierra Club doesn't sell a product. I mean, they sell Merck maybe, but they don't really sell a product. They get money by having people join, become subscribers. People pay a certain amount every year, and that is what funds the Sierra Club. Well, but there's a problem here because the overwhelming number of Americans eat meat. The number of Americans that are actually, vegan is like 2 or 3% or so. It skews in different demographics. Your younger demographic will be higher, but it's a very small minority. Even vegetarian are a small minority. So it gets back to what actually is my fundamental challenge with this course, and that is, we in the U.S., we in the developed world, high-income countries, we who, are doing all this, we are the problem. We are the culprits here. Don't blame, the poorest 3 billion people on the planet, because I keep saying they've done virtually nothing. They're not the problem. We're the problem. But how do you get people to give an organization that's going to complain about you, saying you're the problem? And I say it's my challenge because that's what this course has done. I'm telling you that we're the problem. And you, like the person who gave the earlier comments said, well, I kind of knew this, but I didn't want to know about it because I knew that I was the problem. And the traditional answer to, say Sierra Club is, their approach, which Kip Anderson called out, is that, well, they just don't talk about it because they know that if if they say it, certain people will sour to it. Just the same way that person didn't want to watch the documentary. They're like, I just don't want to keep reading all that information from the Sierra Club. They keep talking about eating meat and I like meat. So I'm probably not going to renew my membership. I think that's the problem. And it's funny because when I give public talks, like if I give talks downtown in Santa Barbara to the general public, and I start talking about all the things I've talked about in this class, why I underscore is kind of my challenge, I can see that when I introduce certain things, I lose part of the audience. I can literally see. Sometimes people actually roll their eyes because they they don't like hearing what I said. So in other words, if we had special effects, I would say something like, well, we all need to eliminate beef altogether. And like, if there are 100 people in the room, if there were a special effect, you could make like 10 of them disappear. And then I said, jump in and say, and we all need to rethink flying. Flying is a problem, and 10 more people would disappear. Cars are a problem, 10 more people. And as I continue going, you're going to lose like most of the audience. And that's a real problem because people don't want to hear the message. And again, these, organizations haven't been getting that message out because of it. But then that raises and I'll pop this comment back on because it's such a good one, it raises this question, how do we educate people regarding this? How do we get this message out? Because most people just don't know. And if they had the memo, they may change. Maybe not becoming fully vegan, but going back to what I said originally, maybe mostly cutting beef out. Maybe they would say, "Oh, I didn't realize beef's so bad. Turkey burgers aren't that bad. I'll just switch." But if people don't know, and if the environmental groups that should be telling them, aren't telling them, that's a problem. That's a big problem. So it's just it's a really on the mark comment. Another source of vegan propaganda. Thankfully that's wrong, and the film takes a much more logical than emotional response. I think this tactic makes the movie much more digestible. Love the use of the word digestible there, to the general public isn't already vegan or vegetarian. A great point and a great note about Kip Anderson here, and it really was a bit of a revolutionary approach in that he focused on climate rather than focusing on animal rights. And I mentioned that subsequent film, What the Health, he focuses on health. But it's clever because if he was, getting this message out and focusing just on the traditional vegan message of animal rights. And I'm a member of PETA. I get PETA's information. They mail you stuff. It's for me, it's difficult, and I grew up on a farm. I've seen a lot, but you open up the information and here's an animal being slaughtered and that picture is right there. And it's like, you think there'd be a better way of getting this message out than doing that. I realize some people take one look at one image like that and swear off animal products their entire life. And maybe that's the idea. Probably is. But you can see why Kip Anderson goes about it a different way, focusing on the climate implications, and then in the subsequent film, focusing on the health implications. Or that other film, which he didn't make, The Game Changers, focuses on, the athletic implications. And all these, sell the idea and communicate to the public in some ways, arguably, I think, more effective way. Yep. And it does make the film more digestible. Love that. I have officially become vegetarian. While I have a lot of critiques on the film, it definitely swayed me over to the green side. Kind of one of the big comments we've got that a lot of people have been swayed over, and another phrase I like, to the green side. I'm glad people are on the green side. And I'm not sure whether that just meant green, like environmentally, like we should all be green, or eating more greens, but either way, good to hear that. A lot of people were swayed by Cowspiracy, and with all its faults, and this person, I'll go back to that comment because I just gave all these, by the way, I've cut part of the comments out. This person noted what a lot of people did. I have a lot of critiques of the film. I don't like the 51% thing, and there are other things that I had a problem with. But the overall impression that the person got was powerful because of Cowspiracy, and this did cause the person to rethink their consumption of meat. So let's see if we can do a couple more here. Curious about dumpster diving. So focusing so much on Cowspiracy, there's that other film we watched, or the part of the class watched, which is Wasted. And a number of people noticed that as soon as they watched Cowspiracy, they turned and watched Wasted. And it is a very good film to watch because, as you know from Project Drawdown now, that's an even bigger problem than eating a plant-based diet, wasted food. Dumpster diving and the idea of being a freegan. I've seen shows like Cheapskate, which I haven't seen. I assume that's the Learning Channel, displaying people jumping in garbage dumpsters drivers behind supermarkets finding food items that were still safe for consumption. Or so it was portrayed. Watching this, I always thought, how come supermarkets don't give this food to shelters or the homeless if it's still good to eat? Looking online, it seems the supermarkets don't want to be held liable for lawsuits or health risks that may be had, while eating things that are past date. When Ken puts up the suggestion to donate food in supermarkets instead of throwing it out, my question would be, is there any way of legally that all this type of food could get donated to supermarkets and not face, donated by supermarkets and not face repercussions? And if so, is that morally correct to donate food that may or may not be safe to consume? I'm truly interested in seeing what kinds of ways to donation of unwanted food can be facilitated safely to citizens instead of being thrown away. Really, really good point. So we're going to meet a freegan in this course insofar as one of the documentaries is about a guy named Peter Kalmus, who's actually a friend of mine, who's a climate scientist down at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And we're going to read something by him as well. Well, freegan first is a word that a lot of people haven't heard, and we're going to talk about it more later. I have a lecture, I cover it. But it's interesting because being a freegan could have more, simply put, if you're a freegan and a really hardcore freegan, it's better for the environment than if you're a hardcore vegan. Ideally, it'd be good if you're a freegan vegan, but it is very important. And the reason for that is, again, that the bigger problem is not that we eat meat, but that we throw so much food away. That gets done in all different sort of ways. It gets done at the consumer level. We don't eat all the food on our plate. We let things go bad in the refrigerator. We, go out to restaurants when we get huge portions we don't eat. So it happens there. It happens at like supermarkets, which is what this person is talking about. We'll address in a minute. And it happens even in the field. And in fact, there was a documentary made a few years ago on the Gleaners, and it was actually made by a UCSB film and media student who was very talented. And it was so good that during the Santa Barbara Film Festival, it actually showed and competed in those films, and was actually shown in the Arlington, which is that huge theater downtown. And I actually went to see it. It was very rewarding because the student was one of my students, and he actually interviewed me, and I got to see myself up on screen on the Arlington and the real film, which is kind of surreal. But anyhow, what Gleaners are about, traditionally, farmers have, harvested everything that they want, and then what they don't want, they leave in the fields. And gleaners have been people, and goes back thousands of years. They're mentioned in the Bible even, or then people who are allowed to go in and get anything that the farmers didn't want. Well, why wouldn't farmers want it? Well, it happens today a lot. So with something like produce, which is hand-picked, which is often a huge social justice issue. The people are picking it, the wages they're making, conditions they're working in, especially now during COVID. It's very problematic. But anyhow, to the point, people who are picking, strawberries, they don't pick strawberries that have a little damage to them. They don't pick strawberries that have a little, bad spot on it. They literally leave all that in the field because it's not commercially viable. That's changing a little. So I haven't been to the Santa Barbara Farmers Market for a while because of COVID, but one of my favorite stands there is an apple producer from pretty close to here. And they actually have a bin of apples that are called visually distressed. And what these are apples that they picked, but they have like a little bad spot on them, or something is not quite right with them. And they sell them for half the price, which growing up on a farm, I guess it always seems important to me to buy those, because they actually are just as good, every bit as good. But they would not be commercially sellable. You're not going to find those if you go to a local supermarket. So a lot of food is wasted, and gleaners, and there's a whole new generation of gleaners out there now who are actually going out and collecting this food to eat. That's another element of being a freegan. If you happen to be at a place, an area like this where there's a local farm, and you and your friends could all go with the okay of the farmer and find any food that was left, and there would literally be, in these cases, whether it's strawberries or apples or whatever, tons and tons of food left in the field. But what this person is talking about or supermarkets, because you have the best by dates, which we've seen in Cowspiracy, and so much food is thrown away because of it. And food is also thrown away for other reasons. And as this person notes, it's a legal issue. So, for example, in California, if a carton of 12 eggs, if one of those eggs breaks, in theory, you'd think it has a crack in it. Well, I'll just take that egg. If you're a marketer, I'll take that egg out and put a fresh egg in, a good egg in, and put it up on the shelf, and everything will be good. No, in California, it is illegal to sell that carton of eggs. That carton of eggs has to get thrown away, or it cannot be sold to the public. So one way that Freegans work on this, work with marketers, is they go to supermarkets, and you're going to see Peter Kalmus do this in the documentary on Being the Change, and they set up an arrangement. So instead of the supermarket taking all that food, for example, that dozen eggs, and throwing it into the dumpster where it would get wasted, and as Cowspiracy noted, 90% of that is going to wind up in landfills. It's not like it's going to be composted, where it's going to produce methane. It's a disaster. But instead of doing that, the supermarket puts it on one of those rolling racks. So you've seen those big racks they roll around in supermarkets that have like bread on it and all. All the food that they're going to throw out, instead of putting it in the dumpster, they put it on the rack, which is pretty much as easy for them, and then they roll it outside. From their point of view, from the legal point of view, they're kind of exploiting a legal wrinkle here. They've thrown it out, and they are not telling anyone to eat this food. They're not giving anyone permission to eat this food. This food is put out there. It's the same as if they've thrown it in the dumpster. However, the difference is this is far easier for people to get and eat because they can just go ahead and get it. And people like Peter Kalmus and other Freegans, they go ahead and get that food. They're taking the legal responsibility of potential problems onto themselves. If they eat a bad egg and they get salmonella, they cannot. I think the hope here is legally, go back to the supermarket and blame them, because the supermarket is not saying that this is safe food. They're saying that for the stuff you buy in the supermarket, but not for stuff that they throw away, or in this case, they kind of roll away. So that's how Freegans are functioning right now, taking on those responsibilities. Food banks will do the same, but food banks usually just have the best by dates, is what they go by. But that's how it works. And you can see, if we rethought the laws and we rethought the way this works, it could make a huge difference. But the other thing to remember about being a Freegan is, that's, I just talked about it in a couple ways of Freegan. One is production end, right before it even leaves the farmer's field. Another is in like a supermarket. Then there are other points in the supply chain, the food system, where it's a problem, like in the factories the food's made and all. We could talk about all that. But in the U.S., the lion's share of it, the big problem with food waste, is at the consumer level. So, if you want to do something about this and you're concerned about it, and you think, well, I'm not so sure if I want to go out and collect food in a farmer's field, or collect food in a farmer's field. I'm not so sure I want to go, essentially dumpster diving. Well, you're in luck. Just think about all the food you wasted. Think about those, best by dates. If the food still seems good, you can still eat it. Not make food that you're, not going to eat, not get food at the restaurant you're not going to eat, not throw food out that you've never eaten. You can think about that too. And again, this is it's far away from windmills and solar panels, which are great, but it is something that you can do directly, just the same way that you can shift away from eating beef or other meat and go to a largely plant-based diet, or just shift from beef to eating other meat and, go for that turkey burger instead. But if you want to do something in terms of this, and this is a big chunk of your emissions, think about food waste and think about it. And I'm going to end on this, I know we've gone a little long. And as the other person noted, how do you get the message out? Well, if the Sierra Club and others aren't. Well, the good thing about Cowspiracy, for all its faults, it did cause a change in that, and Sierra Club now gets the message out. But hey, you can get this message out yourself about, why it's better to eat a turkey burger, or why it's good not to waste as much food. And it's really important. It's just a big part, of our climate footprint. Now, it's not as big a part as Kip Anderson would have us believe. And some people are under the impression, if they become vegan, that they basically solved the problem. Yeah, it'd be great if that were that easy. It's not, but it is a big part of the problem, and it is something that each of us can do, and it is something that if you're interested in food and you watch Cowspiracy, you should also watch Waste It, because you'll see a whole new generation of chefs, and they are making food with the environment in mind, both in the sense of not wasting food in certain ways, but also making food out of menus and all out of really a food that we hadn't normally eaten and all. So it's if you happen to be interested in food and that kind of thing, you find it interesting. Anthony Bourdain, the former celebrity chef, actually is central in it, and also it's fun to watch. Okay, so there you go. That was food. Next deep dive will be on Project Drawdown, and not surprisingly, food leads to the top of that list. If you add up the two things we talked about today, food waste and shifting to a largely plant-based diet, they would be bigger than anything else that we could possibly do on the planet to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. And, when you get down to things like electric cars and all, many, 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 many times bigger. Switching to plant-based diet is 10 times bigger impact than electric cars. And I know that sounds surprising, because electric cars are kind of the go-to example of what a new, economy would look like. Again, I've mentioned why it's a problem, but it is important to think about the relative impact of all this, and I think that's what's so good about Project Drawdown. It lays that out for us. But I'm jumping ahead to the next deep dive, and I've already gone too long. So that's it for today, and I hope you have a good rest. Well, it's still weekend here for me, and it's a long weekend, so hopefully you'll have a good Valentine's Day and a good long weekend because of President's Day. Okay, take care.